Welkom bij Voor de Ommekeer. Gesprekken over een wereld in verandering vanuit het Freedom Lab in Amsterdam. Ik ben David van Overbeek en vandaag heb ik de gast Nolen Gertz. Hij is assistant professor aan de Universiteit van Twente in de toegepaste filosofie. Welcome, Mr. Gertz. And congratulations on your newest book, Nihilism. Last year we talked about your previous book, Nihilism and Technology. Where does your fascination with nihilism come from?
It's an excellent question. I think it's one of those words that because you hear it often thrown around,
That's true.
Social media, newspaper editorials, but you never hear anyone stop to actually define the word. And so for me, that's sort of a red flag that there's something that needs to be interrogated, because it seems like maybe it's being thrown around so much in order precisely to avoid having to actually think about what do we mean by this word.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of confusion about what it actually means, and this book is meant to clarify the concept a little bit more.
Yeah,
No.
That's certainly my hope, since it seems like if everyone on both sides of any argument can accuse the other of a nihilistic perspective, then there's a problem there.
Okay, well, that seems like a very interesting and very good starting point for this conversation. Try to determine what nihilism is. So perhaps in your own words, is it possible for you to say what nihilism is, despite that you're using 200 pages to describe it, of course?
Yeah.
Is it possible to give kind of a...
What's the simplest definition? Yeah, I think the simplest definition would probably be something like how people try to evade reality. And then the question is about the various techniques people use, and then the question also about, is it an individual issue? So is it a psychological way of thinking? Or, as I try to develop in the book, is it actually more political? And that because it's political, the psychological aspect of it is part of the problem. That we are supposed to think of it as, I am a nihilist, you're a nihilist, not that we live in a nihilistic world.
Okay, so perhaps there's some way society is organized that kind of enhances or could perhaps diminish nihilistic psychology within individuals.
Right. That's really the concern that I try to develop through the book, specifically through figures like Simone de Beauvoir, Hannah Arendt, trying to develop this idea that it's, on the one hand, as Hannah Arendt put it, Nietzsche, the German philosopher, was probably the best at identifying nihilism. But because he only thought of it on the psychological level, he didn't get the real perspective needed to identify just how pervasive and especially how political the problem really is.
Okay, yeah. So he was very, you could say, very individualistic about his nihilism.
Right.
Yeah. He looked at nihilism without the broader kind of embeddedness within society.
Yeah, and I think this is not an accident, considering his views. What he's probably most famous for are things like herd mentality. So this idea that any anti-individualism is sort of a escape from freedom, escape from reality. So that's itself nihilistic. Yeah. So of course he seems to be championing at all times anything individualistic. Mm-hmm. And for Hannah Arendt, this is exactly the danger, that individualism is itself a problem that we have to interrogate rather than something to just blindly champion.
Yeah. So when you're talking about people who are avoiding reality, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so the simplest way to think of it would be, if you remember the famous pop song, Don't Worry, Be Happy. So that sort of mentality, which I think you see more and more, especially since 2016, with Trump on the one hand and Brexit on the other, this idea that how do we avoid worries about climate change, about war, about fascism, about Nazism. Mm-hmm. Well, those are someone else's concern. Surely it's okay if I watch Netflix and relax and just try to self-care, this sort of mentality.
So there are imminent problems that need to be solved, but instead of tackling them head on, we evade and we move to our couches and watch Netflix or something like that.
Right. So always putting off concerns. The sort of I'll handle it on the weekend. I'll handle it over the summer, or I'll handle it when I'm retired, and then lo and behold, I'm dead and never got handled. So it's, again, this sort of, any chance I get to sort of put blinders on and focus on minutia of everyday life, the happier I can feel then.
Yeah.
So for example, Sartre in Paris under the occupation talks about how you could live in Nazi-occupied Paris and still have everyday life go on, and how from the outside, he says that seems like, well, then we're collaborators. But he says, you know, if you didn't live through it, you don't understand. On the one hand, you sort of need to get back to everyday life in order to just, you know, not kill yourself. But on the other hand, it's just so remarkably easy, even in those kinds of life or death situations, to really just get concerned about things like, I have to get groceries, I have to feed my family, I have to get to work. So again, this sort of, the everyday life mindset creeps in.
So there's kind of some issues would require some form of resistance or some form of engagement with those problems because they are imminent. But we tend to, there's also a real possibility for humans to, like Sartre describes, you know, engaging with normal life whilst, you know, Nazis are ruling your country. Right. And then obviously that's a metaphor for example, climate change in our situation. Like we need to tackle that problem now. We know we need to tackle it right now, but instead we look for ways to keep going on with everyday life and normal life.
Right, exactly.
That sounds very pathological. Right. Why do you have any idea why humans engage in those kind of practices?
Yeah, well, I think on the one hand you could see it as sort of a survival mechanism. As people often say, whenever you try to, for example, teach existentialism and the idea that, you know, every choice is a free choice, so every choice is your responsibility. People think, well, then that's pathological, because how could you possibly live your life if you had to feel responsible for everything all the time? So everyone always, you know, whenever I talk about this stuff, will respond with like, but surely you can't live that way. So I think that's how it sort of creeps in, this sort of, as I was saying earlier, with this sort of self-care mindset that, you know, you need to be able to relax. You need to be able to find some way to be happy. Otherwise, you know, you'll just break. And I certainly experienced that myself. And I think this is why Nietzsche, you know, describes himself as a nihilist while himself criticizing it. That it seems importantly unavoidable.
And so in your book, you describe kind of you give a history of nihilism, and the way I read it is you're trying to make the point that nihilism, you could say, is of all times. There's always this kind of nihilistic psychological possibility, and it can manifest within individuals and within society. It's not something new within this time or age.
Right.
But perhaps the social circumstance that we live in are very different from the circumstances with, you know, ancient Greece, which you describe as well with Socrates and nihilism in there as well. Could you describe something about our, you know, about the way society is arranged in our times and what that has to do with nihilism in our times? Right.
So I think it's, again, important to think about the pervasiveness of individualism as a sort of taken for granted standpoint. So you get this idea, obviously a human being and an individual person are equivalent, so we can treat them as interchangeable. And this is how you get popular political positions like libertarianism. So the thing that matters most in life are individual rights, individual property. In the United States, this is codified into our foundations in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's always this in terms of my happiness, my life, my liberty. And I think this is what Hannah Arendt is really good about, this idea which has helped her to become more popular today. So Origins of Totalitarianism is again a bestseller. This idea that you know, we have to be afraid of the threat of totalitarianism. But I think what people misunderstand Hannah Arendt's position is this idea that it's not about totalitarianism coming from outside democracy, but rather this idea that it's actually erupting from within democracy itself.
It is possible to come up within democracy itself to kind of to become.
And we saw this exactly with Trump in the United States, and now with Boris Johnson in the UK. So again, this idea that democratic institutions are not a safety against nihilism, not against fascism, but instead can themselves be the way that they get powerful.
Yeah. So this is a problem which is very well known, I guess, within democracies or political theory about democracies, that there's always this weakness about, for example, the way Karl Popper views it. You know, how tolerant can you be towards the non-tolerant? Right. There's kind of this threat within democracies and liberalism as well, that these kind of nihilistic or fascistic theories take over because. Right. But why is that actually? Is it because democracy is well equipped against those kinds of thoughts, or do those thoughts have some kind of alluring power that appeals to people under certain circumstances?
Well, I think you have on the one hand someone like Karl Marx saying that Americans practice freedom of speech once every 4 years. So you have this sort of idea that if you have democratic electoral politics, then that is the mechanism by which, in a democracy, you have your rights asserted, with the idea that you then trust politicians, or as Hannah Arendt calls it, bureaucrats, to take care of the political, freeing you, again, for the life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Mm. And for her, this is the real danger in democratic society, is when it becomes a bureaucratic society. Yeah. And you can see this again in the discussion surrounding Brexit in the United Kingdom, where you have levers on both left and right for different reasons. But again, this idea that in a increasingly bureaucratic society, politics becomes increasingly a bad word. And so I have students frequently who say things, like I don't want to think about politics. I don't want to care about politics. You even have politicians in the United States running for president who say a vote for me is a vote so that you don't have to think about politics ever again. Okay. So again, this idea that in a democracy it's supposed to be we are all participating, but in reality it's I want to elect someone to participate for me. Yeah. So is there something wrong with our democratic institutions right now, that we are unequipped against these kinds of developments? Yeah, well, I think this is the danger when you have people, and this is where social media in my last book would have also come in. This idea that we are having opinions, we are having votes, but we are having opinions and votes about things we don't understand. Mm. So we talk about tax policy, we talk about healthcare policy, we talk about foreign policy, but we don't actually know what's going on the ground. So we just have to trust, again, the intermediary, whether it be the politician, the media, the internet, that tells us this is what's happening, and then we get very outraged about it. Yeah. And then we get outraged about outrage culture. So it's again this sort of, this is why politics becomes a bad word. It's just, I can't trust anyone, and I just feel mad all the time. Yeah. So there's a kind of a massive distrust among politicians, towards politicians, I must say. Right. In your book, you describe this nihilism to be everywhere. You say there's nihilism at home, within pop culture, for example. There's nihilism at school. If you the way students get taught in these days. There is nihilism at work as well, alienation, nihilism at City Hall, the politics especially. This seems to be a very urgent and imminent issue, if I understand you correctly. Right. This idea of nihilism. How do we get to that point? How did we get here? How do we get here? Yeah. So I think that it is sort of fascinating that a lot of the philosophers that I like, who were very, you could describe almost sort of apocalyptic in their views, were coming out of World War II, and we're looking at, on the one hand, at the rise of Nazism, and on the other hand, the rise of the atomic bomb, and seeing the atomic bomb in particular as a fundamental change in human history. This is a new period. So this is what Gunther Anders talks about, for example. This idea that After the atomic bomb, the world has changed fundamentally because now human beings can actually destroy the planet. And this is, again, this idea that so you have all these philosophers who are very concerned about technology, politics, fascism. And what's interesting is they are now looked at from our perspective as, again, they were so negative, they were so pessimistic, but look at how great the world is. Mm. So from the success from the 50s onward, formation of the European Union, you have in the United States, we won the Cold War, so the USSR is over, Reagan is triumphant, you have the end of the Berlin Wall. So again, it seems like we have achieved peace in our time. So all those philosophers were clearly wrong. And I think instead what we need to realize is that what we call peace is what a lot of these philosophers meant by nihilism. And this is what I'm trying to identify in my book, is that the rise of the television set, Gunther Anders already identifies the radio as a concern. This idea of, I want to stay home with my family, watch TV, relax, be happy, have my car, have my house, have my dinner, have my vacation, have my retirement, and then I have a happy life.
Yeah.
Which again means that politics is not my concern. So you get an increasingly bureaucratic world, which creates an increasingly peaceful appearance of world. But at the same time, underneath that appearance, we have the greatest inequality we've ever faced, and we have climate change disaster. And they are now starting to come to a head where you cannot hide your head in the sand anymore because the sand is on fire.
Yeah. Isn't it also the case that the rise of the technological progress, or the rise of machines within society has gone hand in hand with the kind of not trusting politicians, or at least looking at the history of humankind and saying, well, politics is kind of it's a dysfunctioning system, and we need to place our faith in machines or in algorithmic learning or computers, etc., because we humans are fundamentally flawed to deal with these kinds of issues, to deal with politics. We try to when we want to, but we are also flawed in some ways. Right. And doesn't that idea of being flawed also kind of provide the argument why people put more faith or less faith within politics and more put their hopes on and dreams on technology trying to solve that problem of politics for us?
Right. And this is what I find fascinating, again, about Hannah Arendt, is that she's already concerned about the rise of algorithms in the 1950s before algorithms existed. So you're dealing with a pretty good philosopher when they not only predict the future, but they already predict why it's bad. So for her, the rise already of statistics, as on the one hand, scientific, but on the other hand, something that we put our faith in, for her already means that we are becoming inhuman. Because if we are human beings, then for her we are also spontaneous beings. And if we're spontaneous, then the past does not predict the future. So statistical modeling should not be a scientific picture of any predictable model.
Yeah.
Instead, we have statistics giving itself over to algorithms, where we not only have faith in statistics, we have faith in statistics driving the car for us. So it does seem increasingly, and this is even what my first book, talking about military technology, was about, this increasing, the human in the loop is the danger. So how do you get the human out? And then we're safe. And this is what Jacques Ellul, another one of these 1950s apocalyptic thinkers, was concerned about when he talks about in the technological society, the rise of trust in technology being able to take care of everything, because the only value that should concern us is efficiency. And every system has to be viewed in terms of efficiency, inefficiency. Not good, bad, but efficiency, inefficiency. And the human will always be inefficient.
And so if I don't care about this, or let's just say that, going back to your book, I don't care about I give a lot about efficiency, and I don't care about these human values within politics because I just want some invisible system to be there to enable me to do whatever I want, and I don't want to engage within some kind of communitarian squabble with next door persons about how to. Let's say that I don't want that.
Right.
Does that make me a nihilist?
Yes.
Why does that make me a nihilist?
Yeah, because I think, and this is something I've developed in sort of all three books, really, is this idea that there is the sort of fear of friction, would be one way of putting it, right? This idea that I want the path of least resistance whenever possible. And this is, of course, the path chosen by subatomic particles. So it feels right. But at the same time, because it's the path of subatomic particles and the path of animals, it's not the path of human beings.
You mean that the path of least resistance resembles a very deep, something that is very true about nature?
Yeah. So
that kind of...
I mean, water will seek out paths that will get it where it's trying to go easiest, right?
Yeah.
And so you can see this idea of that's how I should live my life too. And this becomes part of popular culture, right? That we should go back to nature, to think in the most natural terms, go meditate in the woods, this kind of thing. Instead of being willing to embrace what it is about humanity that makes us distinct. And again, things like that we are complicated, we are anxious, we will argue, and importantly, that we have very different views on reality. And for Hannah Arendt, again, this is what politics in the Greek sense is really supposed to be all about. That because we all have very limited views of reality, we need to come together in order to have these debates to figure out where we are and what it means to be human. And that when we're not doing that, then we lose a fundamental part of what it means to be.
Yeah, to be human, yeah. So in your book, you're saying this nihilist figure, he's neither a pessimist nor an optimist, but he or she is somewhere in between, but perhaps a bit more close to optimism or pessimism. He or she is definitely not a cynic. And there's also, struck me the most interesting is that you say he or she isn't truly apathetic, but there's this pursuit of apathy that kind of that nails down the essence of what it means to be a nihilist. Right. People want to be uninvolved. Right. People want to be undisturbed, for example. And I immediately thought of a figure of pop culture, you might say, one of the big TV shows of our time, Mad Men, Donald Draper, who seems to be the epitome of someone who is uninvolved all the time, right, yet who does seem to hold large amounts of agency, which is fascinating to us. What does it say about us that these kind of individuals are being portrayed within these shows and that we watch them?
Yeah, no, this is something I've been concerned about for a while. I was certainly worried about Don Draper, just as I was also worried about Breaking Bad. That both shows incredibly popular and seem to have an anti-hero at its core that the audience was supposed to view as a bad person, and yet at the same time was actually viewed reverentially and seemed to sort of inspire, in a way sort of similar to Oliver Stone's Wall Street. This is a movie that was supposed to show us how bad Wall Street is, and instead inspires a generation of Wall Street brokers who want to be like that. So I do think there is, as you were saying, in Don Draper, this sort of, get drunk as much as possible, have sex as much as possible, get as much money as possible, live life to the fullest, that kind of idea. And then in the last season, it seems like he's having an existential crisis that's driving him to have a new way of life. But spoiler alert, instead it's all just a big Coke commercial.
That is a spoiler alert indeed, yeah. But then again, there are some big differences, you might say, between Breaking Bad and Donald Draper, Mad Men, is that within Breaking Bad, the hero or the anti-hero is he's shown to be somewhat of a loser, you might say.
Mm.
It's very hard to feel kind of jealous of his kind of life, whereas Donald Draper is obviously leading a life that some people find very fascinating or alluring. It's very beautiful, the beautiful women, stuff like that. So there are these differences between that. Yet both shows, like you say, they wanted to show that this ideal isn't actually something that should be idealized, but it's something that we should probably be more critical about. And they failed to live up to that.
Right.
How does that work?
Yeah, I think you can even trace this back to Scorsese's Taxi Driver, right? You're not supposed to see Travis Bickle as a hero, and yet he inspires a copycat who tries to assassinate Ronald Reagan to make Jodie Foster fall in love with him. Which is why it's kind of fascinating, the sort of recent debate about Scorsese saying, superhero movies, I don't like them, when it seems like his movies are just the gangster version of superhero movies. And they seem to, I think, importantly fill a void in the culture, which in a sense you could trace back, I know this is going to seem like a leap, but the German philosopher Edmund Husserl wrote a book called The Crisis of the European Sciences in the 1930s, where he says that science filled a cultural place that it doesn't fill anymore. But rather than something else filling it, it's just kind of created this void where we no longer have this sort of feeling that we are all involved in scientific pursuit. We are all involved in the knowledge pursuit. But instead, it seems like scientists, they go do science, and we just wait for the result. And if we get our jetpacks, we're very happy. So again, similar to how politics gets removed, science gets removed, religion gets removed, and it creates all these voids in our culture where we no longer have the sort of standards, the sort of practices that we've been used to, and we're sort of looking around everywhere for something to cling to.
Yeah, and perhaps even more seriously, there's this idea that trying to create a framework, whatever framework that might be, feels like an absurd idea to do because it's contingent. Every framework that we make, we also realize immediately that this is kind of a contingent idea that we cling on to.
Right.
And that there are no fundamental ideas, there's no authority without us that we can appeal to, or some higher truth that can cling on to.
Yeah, it seems like this can help to see a connection between nihilism and fascism, that you have this void. Simone de Beauvoir describes this as this sort of childlike innocence where we think, adults, they have all the answers, so I'm free to just have fun, and adults, they understand for me. Yeah. And then this idea that when you become an adult, you sort of see behind the curtain and realize that adults actually don't have all the answers, and that from an Aristotelian perspective, you've actually been making important decisions this whole time. You just didn't think about it. Yeah. So you've created a character for yourself, and suddenly adults are holding you responsible. And so for de Beauvoir, this is how we become what she calls the serious person. This sort of, I need to find some standard, something I can cling to. And so you can see why a populist authoritarian figure coming along saying, as Trump did, I have all the answers, can become very intoxicating for people who want, again, that childlike, father will protect me feeling. So it's not an accident, this sort of populism, fascism, nationalism, authoritarianism all get sort of tied into each other. And the problem is that when you see that Trump doesn't actually have all the answers, that does not lead to a re-embracing of politics in the public square, but who's the next father I can cling to?
Yeah.
And this is, again, what Nietzsche was worried about, why he said, God is dead, but we're just going to keep finding God after God after God.
Yeah. So there's this kind of paradox that within the philosophy, it's called the death of God. The highest values have been diminished, but yet we are, as human beings, we keep on looking for some higher value without ourselves to cling on to, and yet at the same time we realize that that's a very unfruitful idea to pursue, because it's just another authority,
right,
which will set us up eventually for disappointment.
Right.
Right. I was entertaining the idea that after reading your book, that this idea of nihilism and the spreading of nihilism, as you say, is not only psychology but it's also cultural. Doesn't that perhaps have to do with a lack of agency? Because that was kind of struck me that the word agency never occurred in the book, and yet at the same time it seems to me to be somewhat of a very important part of the problem, is that when people have, especially when you talk about alienation of work and about the way education is being hollowed out and standardized, pop culture, perhaps people aren't capable of taking responsibility for their actions, and so they lack some form of agency which you can live up to.
Yeah, no, and I think this is sort of what the illusion of liberal individualism that comes from the Enlightenment is so important, and this is why someone like Michel Foucault is so concerned about this idea that autonomy, where you get the idea of agency from, is an illusion. And this idea that again gives rise to things like libertarianism, for me is a politics for pod people. It's not for human beings. It's for people who are born adults who don't need anybody. So for Hegel, it's a radical claim that he begins his philosophy of right by saying humans are born into families, and this is like devastating. Like, oh my God, I didn't remember I had a family. That I'm actually born very weak, needy, desperate for others. Yeah. And if you look at my colleague Peter Paul Verbeek, this is why, for him, technology reveals, similar to Foucault, that we were never autonomous and that we need others, whether those others are human beings or technological beings, to get us through life. Yeah. So that, importantly, clinging to agency, clinging to me-first attitudes, gets us dangerously into an illusory way of thinking. And then when that is shattered, rather than realize, well, we've just been, and this is what postmodernism is all about, realizing that we've been living a lie the whole time, we just blame and get mad at whoever shattered that illusion. Yeah. And then within that blame, perhaps there's violence in there as well, right? Or and the violence is channeled within our time, perhaps on Twitter, or these Twitter outrages, which you described in your earlier work, right? Where we go online and then we get outraged about the outrage, right. But it's also part of our own understanding as well. Well, in the book you say technologies are increasingly interfering with our ability to lead autonomous lives, to be able to think rationally and to be able to make decisions based on what we know to be true, rather than merely on what is presented to us as true. Which would it kind of seems that within this book you're trying to preserve a very humanistic idea of what it means to be human, and you tend to value that as well. Perhaps that also shines through with your empathetic stance on Hannah Arendt and her ideas. Why is that humanistic idea of humanity so important to you? Yeah, well, it's interesting because this is something that Peter Paul Verbeek and I debate about a lot, because he read my last book and said, you're a humanist. So for him that means bad word, because we're supposed to be post-human. All right. So what's interesting for me is that when we say humanist, do we mean, again, something like an Enlightenment humanist, so the kind of thing that Foucault is criticizing? Or do we mean, which is what I'm trying to do, figure out actually what does it mean to be human, and then how can we be sort of reclaiming that humanity? So I do think for a lot of people, when we say humanist, we again think in terms of autonomy, agency, rationality. these sort of Enlightenment values of what it means to be human. And I think that's why Peter Paul was sort of worried, like, oh, you're going back to that model. And I'm trying to say, no, I completely understand and am supportive of the project to recognize our heteronomous nature. But that to me doesn't mean that then I have to give myself over from human being to technological being, but rather just in the same way that Aristotle talks about, realize that I'm a social being, that to be human is to need other people, to need material support, that I cannot function on my own. So again, this idea that what it means to be human might be not that I can be reduced to the individual, but that I can be reduced to a community.
Well, this dependence on other people, like this fundamental dependence on other persons that we have as human beings, not only when we are born, but also throughout life, it seems to be a very theological or maybe spiritual claim, I guess you would say. Bad word maybe, but kind of because individualism also seems like a very logical position, trying to attain your autonomy within a certain system, etc., and then trying to be weak or trying to be open or at least admit that you're weak or that you're... that seems like it takes a kind of leap of faith, perhaps not in the very strict religious sense, but at least in a kind of a spiritual sense, in that to acknowledge that.
Right.
Do you see any, is there any, way forward in that, in that advancement of those kinds of debates about spirituality? Because they kind of seem, it seems like they're, within the debate about these kind of topics on nihilism, those words are always, they are avoided because it seems to refer to something that we left behind, a couple of years ago.
Yeah, no, I do think it's important to take seriously this idea. On the one hand, religion has a nihilistic aspect to it because of its other-worldliness, which again represents an evasiveness of reality. I don't have to be worried about this world because there's a world to come. So whether we're talking about Plato's theory of the forms, and there's a whole sphere outside of us, or we're talking about heaven and hell, it still seems like some sort of displacement of concern from this world to the next. And today that comes in the form of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos trying to get to Mars. And why this should inspire fear in us that we've sort of given up on Earth. So you could imagine some people saying, well, if we had a more spiritual sense of the Earth as God, something more like Wicca, for example, wouldn't that help us to fill a void and to become ecological from a spiritual perspective? But I would still worry that then we're not ecological for the sake of the ecological, we're ecological for the sake of what it does for me. And that's going to just create the same problem that got us here in the first place. So I do think any sort of evasive spirituality, and it's hard to imagine a spirituality that would not be ultimately evasive, seems like a short-term solution but a long-term threat.
Yeah, because it ultimately leads to what does it mean to me, or what can I benefit from, what can I gain from it?
Right.
But if I understand you correctly, it has to be something that transcends this individualism. It has to be an appeal to humanity as a whole, because that's obviously the problems which we're facing right now, right? The climate change, which we started out with, it calls out for an appeal to not only me and my brothers and sisters or family or even my parents or people nearby, but the entire planet, basically.
Right.
And why I'm using the word spirituality here is because, well, perhaps this idea that you also mentioned, this humanistic image of the productive individual who utilizes the earth as raw material for his productive being, and then is kind of uninvolved about the consequences of that productiveness. That seems to be kind of the spiritual motive of our Western productive world, and yet at the same time we seem to reach the end of that spiritual image, because obviously we know the limitations of this world, and we cannot be uninvolved about the consequences towards our planet anymore.
Right.
So perhaps that kind of the switch, it's very hard to formulate kind of a language towards that. And so when I read your book Nihilism, I also feel very empathetic towards it, because I think it's too large of a subject to think about. It's too large of a, how do you organize politics, for example, to kind of realize a new way of being in the world, not on an individual level, but on a political level. So it's easier for me to just chill out and watch Netflix and not be concerned. Where's the way out?
Right. Yeah, no, I think this is what I've been struggling with through all of my books, is trying to figure out what's the solution here. And I do think on some level that I would want maybe not something spiritual, but I can certainly see that we have to have faith in something. So my former advisor, Simon Critchley, wrote a book called Faith for the Faithless, right? So there has to be something, right? And you can imagine that the question is, how do we move from faith in God to faith in Google, to instead a faith in ourselves and a faith in each other? And I think this is, again, what Hannah Arendt is worried about, and why she says that the world we live in can be described as basically a desert world. And that what we call, for example, psychology, for her is just a way to help us to adapt to life in the desert, rather than to see in our suffering that the desert itself is what needs to be changed, not us, but the world. So the very suffering that could have prompted political revolutionary response, instead we see as personal failing, psychological failing, to be treated through therapy. And again, this is what I'm concerned about now with technology, that we are increasingly seeking therapeutic methods to avoid suffering, rather than facing our suffering. So for me, that's the best answer I can come up with, is to see in our suffering the need to make a change on a political scale, not a personal scale.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Gertz.
Thank you.